Good morning and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Jen Judson, Vice President of the National Press Club and a reporter for Defense News. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners Newsmaker with General John W. J. Raymond, the Chief of Space Force Operations, United States Space Force. We're happy to accept questions from our audience today, and I'll ask as many questions as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. Space has always captured the imagination of humans throughout history, sparking curiosity about worlds beyond our own and powering an urge to both explore and conquer. As our technology has advanced, so has our ambition. Since 1957, when the then Soviet Union launched the space race with its launch of Sputnik, the outer reaches of Earth's atmosphere have become more than the stuff of science fiction. Indeed, space is now a matter of national security. Earth's thermosphere and exosphere are riddled with satellites, both commercial and military, from dozens of countries. We depend on them for the common trappings of everyday life in the 21st century: mobile phones, GPS, internet, TV, weather reports, and communications of every sort. And the competition for the space in space is fierce. Controlling and monitoring space was the domain of the US Air Force until March 2018, when President Donald Trump announced his intent to create a US Space Force. On December 20th, 2019, Trump signed the US Space Force into being as part of the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, creating the first new branch of the military since 1947. We are delighted to have with us today the first commander of that new branch, Air Force General John W. J. Raymond, the first Chief of Space Force Operations. General Raymond, a Clemson grad, commissioned through ROTC, has a long history of military service, having spent more than 35 years in the US Air Force. Part of that history appropriately includes commanding the Air Force Space Command and the Joint Force Space Component before the creation of the standalone branch, and he's been awarded numerous medals and decorations, including multiple awards of the Legion of Merit and Distinguished Service Medals. We look forward to hearing his outlook on the state of space and learning what this new branch has achieved in its first year of existence. General Raymond, welcome to the National Press Club. I'll turn it over to you for some remarks.
Well, good morning, Jen, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and looking forward to a great dialogue. I sure wish I could be there in person, but we're getting more fluent at these Zoom calls. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity. The United States has long known that access to and freedom to maneuver in space is a vital national interest. And the role of the Space Force is to ensure that space remains accessible, stable, and secure, very similar analogous to the Navy's role in securing sea lanes. Congress quickly realized that securing maritime approaches and trade routes would be vital for a young nation with a vast shoreline. They knew that our security and viability as a nation depended on access and freedom to maneuver in the world's ocean. And since its, since its earliest days, the Navy has been a global force, protecting commerce, developing safe navigation, promoting diplomacy, and projecting American power in defense of our interests. Today, space offers the power of commerce and connection, tempered by the challenge of competition and potential conflict. Spacefaring nations, like seafaring nations, reap the benefit of access to and use of space and security in and from the domain. As a country, we are leading in an era that will be defined by rapid global growth in space commerce, exploration, and military activities. This is an exciting time to be in the space business. And as the world's leading spacefaring nation, space is infused into every facet of our daily life. Even though it may not be readily apparent, the Space Force is unique in that it has a strong and daily connection with nearly every American. GPS enables people and goods to move efficiently around the world. Precision timing signals synchronize clocks on our smartphones, enable global financial transactions, and optimize the performance of critical infrastructure. Real-time weather, traffic, and news information is beamed from space to our fingertips. 24 hours a day, the missile warning sensors protect our homeland and our forces around the world. And today, America's security and prosperity, our way of life, and our confidence in peace all depend on space. Unfettered access to the domain underpins everything that we do as a country. It underwrites our national security, it promotes scientific discovery, it fuels our economy, and it enhances every single instrument of our national power. But the challenge the Space Force is addressing is that access to space can no longer be treated as a given. The domain that enables our way of life is a contested domain. The question that American people must consider is not whether there are threats in space. There are. It's not whether adversaries intend to develop capabilities to attack our space capabilities. They do, and they have developed those capabilities. It's not about whether there is still a choice to return to engaging space as a completely benign domain, something that we really would like, but that ship has sailed. The central question the Space Force comes to work every day focused on is addressing what must be done so that every American will never know a day that without space capabilities at their fingertips. You know, when you walk into a room and you turn the lights on, the lights always come on. We want the same thing to happen for space. What actions must we take now to be prepared to protect this vital national interest? And how best can we integrate with our allies and our partners to ensure no adversary believes they could achieve their objectives by beginning or extending conflict into space? Let me put a little bit of a finer point on the threats that we currently see. China's military modernization is the pacing challenge of our time. China can contest every operational domain and has undertaken aggressive space development programs over the last 15 years. China is doing two things that are concerning. First of all, they're developing their own space capabilities for their own use, and so so they'll enjoy the same benefits that we've enjoyed by integrating space into our way of war and our way of life. But most concerning is that they're developing a spectrum of threats to negate our access to space and to keep our nation and our allied partners from being able to realize the benefits that we derive from those space capabilities. So let me put an even finer point on it. Today, they have jammers that can jam our communication satellites and our global positioning satellites. Again, satellites that we rely on as Americans each and every day. They have laser systems that can blind or damage our satellites. China has missiles that they can launch from the ground and to destroy a satellite in low Earth orbit. We saw that very visibly back in 2007 when they shot down one of their own satellites and created a debris field of about 3,000 pieces of debris that still remains in space today. China also has a satellite with a robotic arm on orbit that could grapple another satellite in the future. And China is developing cyber threats to hack our satellite systems. And it's not just China. Russia has similar capabilities as well. So you put all that together and you'll see a spectrum of threats, a spectrum that is broad, robust, and very concerning. The scope of the threat, when coupled with how absolutely critical space is to our nation, was a clear call to organize, train, and equip a service of professionals who are focused on this domain and ready to protect the space capabilities that we are so reliant on. That's why the establishment of the Space Force is so important. We are purpose-built to move at speed and to operate in this domain against this growing threat. Creating the Space Force has enabled our military to meet the challenges of protecting that domain. Protecting the domain has already produced tangible results, not possible prior to the creation of the service. Because the nation elevated space, our guardians can focus our space-minded and global perspectives towards addressing the world's toughest challenges, such as being protectors of the nation's freedom of action in space, being providers of space power to the joint force, every American, and to more than 4 billion users worldwide, and be partners to sister services, the interagency, the joint force, and our traditional and non-traditional allies. And finally, pathfinders serving in a role that echoes the expeditions of Lewis and Clark and Theodore Roosevelt's world-circling naval fleet, innovating with other U.S. agencies and allied organizations. So, as you mentioned in your opening remarks or your introductory remarks, we're about 14 months old. 20 December, the National Defense Authorization Act was signed. That was our birth certificate, and this first year was all about inventing this force, building this force. And an unbelievable amount of work was done in the first year. 22 of our guardians got together and drafted a foundational doctrine called space power. We completed the largest reorganization in the history of the national security enterprise. We slashed 2 layers of command out of the organizational structure, empowering the experts in the field to go fast and to be able to compete. We stood up a very lean and agile headquarters at the Pentagon. In fact, initial planning had that headquarters at over 1,000, and we slashed it down to just about 600. We've competitively selected 6,400 tech-savvy, diverse, and joint-minded airmen to transfer into the service to be guardians. And every one of those guardians was purposely picked to be able to compete and secure the space for our nation. We're investing in them and have 10,000 civilians that are also assigned to the force today. We built culture and identity items tailored around a unique history, a heritage, and a mission of military space professionals. So now that we're into year 2, our focus shifts. We still have some building to do, but our focus now is driving this car that we built, and we need to drive it with our foot firmly planted on the accelerator to go fast, and integrating this Space Force across our nation. Again, this integration is the natural step for a service whose capabilities underwrite every instrument of national power. Through deeper integration across the joint force, the interagency, deeper integration with industry, and with our allies and partners, we will enhance America's competitive advantage in all other domains. We will develop a force who can work in unity with partners to fully leverage this new service. We started fast on this year of integration when the Space Force became the 18th member of the intelligence community, integrating into that community back in January. Other key lines of effort include a human capital strategy that allows us to win the battle for talent and recruit, educate, develop, and retain demographically and cognitively diverse force. I'll tell you, it's not a big challenge because we have more people knocking on our door right today that want to come into the Space Force than we have positions for. So we're being very, very selective. We'll determine how we should present forces to combatant commanders so Guardians can deliver advantage to military operations around the globe. And we'll bring unity of effort to force design, to reduce duplication of effort, to reduce costs, and to be able to move at speed. Finally, it is significant and worth mentioning that we are not the only nation to have elevated space in its military. We're working very closely with our allies and partners. For example, the United Kingdom is in the process of establishing their space command. France established a space command and renamed its Air Force the French Air and Space Force. Japan established its first space operations squadron. And NATO just is establishing a space operations center in their air command in Germany. So when space was a benign domain, we really didn't need international partners. All you really needed to do was be able to launch satellites and have it survive launch, and you were good to go. That's not the case today. And just like all other services, we have built partnerships that increase our total capability and allow us to stand together against malign actors in space. We form close international partners. And today, we train together, we exercise together, we war game together, we operate together. And for the very first time, we're building capabilities together and exploring the development of norms of responsible behavior in space. Through unity at home and abroad, we are building strength in space. Moving forward, the United States has the opportunity to lead with American values, to establish the trust and the relationships necessary to create norms of responsible behavior. Cooperation will be the hallmark of our approach to military activities in space. While our competitors are moving fast alone, we will go farther together with our partners and our allies. In modern warfare, space power is a vital component of military strength. As the world's foremost spacefaring nation, the United States has not rested on its laurels. Rather, our nation has adapted its approach to ensure we can deter conflict from beginning or extending into space, and to be able to provide those capabilities to our nation without fail. As a nation, we have risen to the challenge to preserve and advance American security, prosperity, discovery, and values in space. And as guardians, we will ensure the benefits of space remain an American birthright, always there, always above. That's our motto, Semper Super. Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some opening comments, and I hope that primes the pump for a good set of questions and good dialogue. Again, Jen, I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, General. I wanted to just jump in and ask a very basic question of you, but something that the American public has been asking quite a bit over the last year, which is, tell me why the Space Force needs to exist as an established independent military branch. Why not just keep everything with the Air Force?
It's a great question. If you look back in history, every domain of warfare has a service that's attached to it, if you will, that focuses on it. So I talked in my opening comments about the Navy and the maritime domain. We've got the world's best Army, and they're focusing on, obviously on the ground domain. We've got the world's best Air Force that's focusing on the space domain. And as space has become more contested, it became clear that space was a warfighting domain, just like those other domains. And so the United States took an opportunity. We're the best in the world at space today. That superiority margin has been shrinking. And there was an opportunity to stand up this service, to have a service that's, again, purpose-built, focused on the challenges of this domain, to capitalize on that opportunity to always stay ahead and be the world's leader in space. And so it was an opportunity, and I'll tell you the opportunity is already paying great dividends.
Okay, a recent report highlighted the fact that there's a great deal of classification when dealing with space defenses and the activities you'd be doing as a Space Force. And you've spoken about the need to make it easier to talk to the public about what you do. So how do you manage the need to make it easier to tell the public what you're doing so they understand what the Space Force is doing while dealing with the highly classified nature of your operations?
Yeah, so the main mission of the United States Space Force is to deter conflict from beginning or extending into space. And I'm convinced that if you want to change the deterrence calculus, if you will, of an adversary, you have to be able to communicate. If you have everything classified, that really erodes your ability to deter conflict, and that's what we want to do. We want space to remain peaceful. We want it to remain a safe haven for all to operate in, to provide that foundation for all of our instruments and national power. And we're convinced that you have to be able to talk about it. I think reducing classification also helps us integrate better with our allied partners and with our joint and coalition, joint forces around the globe as well. And so for a bunch of reasons, we view that there is a requirement to reduce classification. We're doing that as we speak, and I'm excited for where that's headed.
Can you talk a little bit about the timeline for being able to reduce classifications? You're saying you're beginning to do that. So, what does that mean for the next couple of years as you're working on your messaging and trying to explain to everybody what it is that you're doing? What are some tangible things that you're doing to reduce those classifications at this time?
Yeah. So first of all, we're developing a strategy, and so you don't want to just do make decisions one piece at a time. You'd like to have an overarching strategy that helps guide those decisions. And so there's been a lot of work put on to develop that strategy. We worked very closely with the acquisition community to allow some more access to commercial industry, to be able to have access to classified, to allow them to integrate more effectively with us as well. You'll see us, as we develop new programs and review older programs, review it with a lens of deterrence and a lens of integration. And so you'll see us continue to make classification decisions that will enable that deterrence and that integration.
Okay.
But it starts with the strategy.
Okay, great. Thank you. The Biden administration has come out in support of the Space Force broadly as an organization. So based on conversations with the administration so far, what sort of role do you think President Biden will have in the ongoing stand-up of activities? Do you think space is a place where Biden has a lot of interest similar to President Trump?
I think the United States has long known that access to space is a vital national interest. I mean, it as I said, it provides the foundation for our national security. It provides our foundation for the economy. It provides foundation for exploration. None of that is on a downward trend. It's all on an upward trajectory. And so the importance of space is critical today, and it's moving in a direction that's even more critical. So I think it's really clear and really appreciated the President Biden's administration coming out supporting the Space Force. I think it's really clear this is not a political issue. This is an issue of national security. This is about foundation, our national security and the foundation of all instruments and national power, and look forward to continuing our efforts to build this service, again, with our foot on the accelerator, to be able to meet the mission, our critical mission that we've been given.
Okay. Let's dive a little bit more onto the threat side. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies just came out with their report, Defense Against the Dark Arts in Space. that looked at protecting space assets from counter space weapons and laid out some pretty interesting scenarios involving Russia and China and Iran. What can you tell us about the threats and challenges we face in the space domain? And diving a little bit deeper, can you, and now that you're working to try to unclassify things a little bit more, can you say more in this unclassified forum about steps you're taking to actively defend satellites in ways that doesn't create more space debris or risk turning a confrontation in space into a conflict in space or elsewhere?
Yeah, so, in my opening remarks, I went through a pretty significant and detailed walkthrough of the threats that we're seeing. It's that spectrum of threats is alive and well, if you will. It's broad. It's concerning. Both China and Russia continue to develop those threats. We're the best in the world in space, and I am very comfortable that today we can protect and defend the capabilities that we rely on as a nation. The reason why we stood up a Space Force is that we can make sure we can stay ahead of those growing threats. And we do that in a variety of ways. We do that working closely with our allied partners and their strength in that partnership. We work very closely integrating space into the rest of the joint force. If you look at what our national security strategy says, it says freedom or access to and freedom to maneuver in space is a vital national interest. And it goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if anybody threatens our ability to meet that first vital national interest, we'll respond at a place, time, and domain and manner of our choosing. And so it's not just space for space sake. We also develop tactics, techniques, and procedures. We've upgraded the training and the development of our Space Force. We've completely overhauled how we develop our guardians to make sure that they can operate more effectively in a contested domain. So there's a series of, it's not one thing that we're doing. It's the entire Space Force is focused on changing how we operate to be able to shift towards this warfighting domain.
Okay. Also in the CSIS report, it laid out what makes sense for Space Force to develop and deploy a capability to physically seize objects in space, such as satellites, when the other satellite's intent is unknown or possibly threatening. This U.S. physical seizure capability would obviously be purely defensive and protective, but are you working on such a program, or do you plan to?
I'm not going to get into the specifics of what we may or may not be working on. I will tell you, though, we are committed, absolutely committed to making sure that we can remain the leaders in space and protect and defend the domain of which we rely on very heavily. Okay.
And I know you are beginning to think about this, or you are thinking about it and figuring out what this all means, but would a directed action by a foreign satellite against a U.S. satellite asset, such as blinding a telescope with a laser, be considered an act of war? If not, then under what circumstances would a deliberate hostile act by a satellite be considered an act of war?
I think it depends. And I don't think there's a one answer that fits that. I think it depends on the strategic context that's going on in the world. In my opinion, there's no such thing as a space war. It's war, and nations might choose to conduct that operations in that war, that conflict, either on the sea or in the air or on the ground or now in space. And so I think just like every other traditional domain of warfare, this is just integrated into that larger strategic conflict, if you will, and it's not a one answer that you can give to that question.
Okay. Jumping over to sort of another aspect is the explosive growth of commercial small satellites, cube satellites, nano satellites. It's raised concerns about the level of debris or space junk in lower Earth orbit. Does Space Force intend to address this issue, either through governance or technology, in order to minimize the risk of collisions in LEO?
Yeah, we are addressing that today. Today, the Space Force provides capability, and our Guardians operate capabilities that serve as the space traffic control for the world. We track close to 27,000 objects in space. Of those 27,000 objects, about high 3,000s, 3,800 or so are active satellites. Everything else is a piece of debris. We provide warning to the world. We do all the analysis of every object that's in space against every other object to make sure that two objects don't collide to create more debris. We provide warning, and we tell, in fact, we warned China to, if one of their satellites is about to hit a piece of debris they created when they blew up one of their satellites again back in 2007. We are as transparent as we can be, because we want to keep that domain safe for all. The other thing that we're doing is that one of the ways you solve the debris problem is not to create debris in the first place. And so, having better engineering standards, so when satellites end their life, they don't break apart into pieces, or having stronger launch standards, so when you launch a satellite, it doesn't put pieces of debris into orbit as well. And we're doing all of those things. So we're sharing data broadly. We've got strong partnerships in the domain awareness business. We provide warning for the world to keep that domain safe for all. And then we've increased our standards to make sure that we cannot create debris, as I mentioned, either on launch or on end of life of a satellite.
Okay. The United States Global Positioning System and Global Navigation Satellite Systems are the crown jewels of America's national security, architecture, and digital economy. Can you comment on the level of international cooperation and working with the United States on issues of GPS resiliency, such as interoperability with foreign global navigation satellite systems?
Yeah, so GPS is the world gold standard. It is the best in the world at that capability. It's relied on by the world to provide, in billions of users around the world, to provide navigation and timing. It's operated by a group of about 100 Guardians out in Colorado Springs. The average age of those Guardians is probably 21, 22 years old. And I'm very proud of that team, and I'm very proud of all of our teams that provide these critical capabilities. As I mentioned in my opening comments, international partnerships are significant, and we are working interoperability on a whole spectrum of fronts, not just on GPS, but clearly in the GPS mission area, because of its importance to the globe. We work very closely with our international partners to make sure that there is interoperability.
Do you have exercises or things like that planned? How are you working closely with your partners?
Yeah, we do. We as I said up front, we exercise together, we war game together. We have a game called the Schriever War Game where we have allied partners. We have we integrate into war games. We have increased the amount of training slots at our schools, so they come to some of our foundational schools for training our space operators. We've opened those up to our allied partners. We have allied partners in our operations centers. And so out at the Combined Space Operations Center at Vandenberg, when we stood up U.S. Space Command back in August of 2019, one of the things that we did was we made one of the components of U.S. Space Command was a combined component, meaning they operate with our partners. It's called the Combined Space Operations Command. It falls under General Dickinson's leadership at U.S. Space Command, but the center that command operates is called the Combined Space Operations Center, and that center has allied partners in it. We also have partners that help us operate our capabilities. We also have data sharing partnerships where data collected from other nation sensors feeds into our situational awareness data. We now are also building capabilities together. Just this past year, we signed an MOU with Japan to put hosted payloads on Japanese satellites, which will allow us to get capability onto orbit quicker, because their satellite was already being developed, and we just are integrating a payload onto it. We did the same thing with Norway. With Norway, we put two communication payloads on two Norwegian satellites. It'll save us over $900 million, almost $1 billion, and we'll get capability onto orbit 3 years earlier. So those partnerships, what used to be largely one-way data sharing partnerships, have now turned into much more robust partnerships like we see in every other domain.
Great. there's been debate over the years over the pros and cons of using commercial satellites or renting space on commercial satellites for military capabilities. Where would you say we are in this now, and how would it or might it affect Space Force operations and missions?
We want to have a very strong and tight fused relationship with commercial industry. We think it gives us great advantage. We have relied over the history, the two things that have been commercially viable in space are commercial launch and large communication satellites. And so we have relied on those for years. What has changed now, though, is that as technology has advanced and smaller satellites are become more operationally relevant, almost every mission set in space has a commercial viable path. And we think that commercial partnership will provide us great advantage. You see it does in launch, for example. With commercial launch, the cost of launch has been reduced significantly. If you look at where commercial industry is moving with reusability and with autonomy, we think there's great opportunities to capitalize on that as well. The other thing that I'm really excited about, besides just the capabilities that are being developed, is the business model that they're using. They are developing kind of the assembly line approach for satellites. That's a different business model than what we use. We typically take a significant amount of time. They're larger satellites. We put a lot of mission assurance on it, and commercial industries move in a different direction. And we think the sweet spot is probably a hybrid approach where we'll rely very heavily on commercial satellites and that business model to produce operationally relevant satellites, and then we'll have some really exquisite capabilities as well.
Okay. I think this somewhat answers a question that's just come in, but what role, if any, do private companies like SpaceX play in the Space Force mission? And you did touch on this in your answer, but if you can expand.
Yeah, so I'll because the question said SpaceX, I'll give an example of SpaceX, but there's a lot of commercial, I say this kind of jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, it's a terrible word to use in the commercial business, but there's an explosion of commercial space stuff happening. I mean, there's lots of different companies that are out there building. But to bring this to life based on the question, we rely very heavily on SpaceX to launch our satellites on their rockets. And so we operate 2 launch sites, one in Florida at Cape Canaveral, and then one at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The one in Florida we launch satellites largely into geosynchronous orbit, which is a really high orbit that provides persistence. And then in the one in California, we launch satellites into polar orbit, which is a lower Earth orbit. And depending on the mission of the satellite, it depends on which orbit you put it in. But at both of those launch sites, SpaceX launches rockets. And when we have a satellite that needs to be launched, there's a couple different providers. ULA is another provider, but we do a procurement of a launch vehicle, buying a service, and and for those satellites that SpaceX is going to launch, we put the satellite on top of a SpaceX rocket, and they launch from our launch sites to be able to put those into orbit. The interesting thing, to bring out a little bit of the innovative nature of commercial industry, typically when we do launches, that we have telemetry dishes and radars and optical telescopes, if you will, to be able to track a launch, to make sure it's safe, because our responsibility is for a safe and effective launch operation, protect the areas around Florida and California, for example. We bring in a crew force that mans all those capabilities, and it is trained to determine if a launch vehicle is moving from a safe corridor of launch, and if it does, we have trained operators that push a button and send a signal to blow up that rocket, because we want to protect society. SpaceX has made this all autonomous. And so their rocket can sense itself whether it's going astray, and if it goes astray, it will blow itself up. We've certified all that to make sure that is a safe way of doing business, but it reduces all the infrastructure, or most of the infrastructure. It reduces costs, and it significantly increases our ability launch more rockets off of the launch sites because we can turn the range around quicker. And so that's one example of where we're using SpaceX. There's other companies that we are using as well, and are really looking forward to doing business with them. And now as commercial satellite constellations are really picking up development, we look forward to leveraging those as well.
Okay. Is the Space Force working to hire commercial tracking services? Have you begun working to tap into these services, and to what extent?
When I'm not sure I
Commercial
understand.
tracking services, like being able to track what's out there in space.
Yeah, so
Commercial.
that's another one of those mission areas that has become commercially viable. There are commercial companies that track satellites in orbit, and we do integrate with those companies. We do leverage them and buy their data to help us keep track of everything that's going on in space. It's a significant job. I mean, there's a lot of, if you think about how vast space is, the operational, the AOR for space assigned to U.S. Space Command is 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface and higher. That is huge. And then if you look at the numbers of objects that are out there, and then if you look at the speed of which that operations take place, I mean, a satellite in low Earth orbit, to stay in orbit, has to go 17,500 miles an hour. And so it is a big challenge. And we have guardians that are highly skilled at being able to operate the sensors, collect the data, analyze the data, make the warning to the world to keep things from colliding, to keep that domain safe. But it's a big challenge, and we leverage capabilities that we operate. We leverage capabilities that our allies and partners operate, and we leverage commercial industry to do that, to help us as well.
Okay, thank you. I have a question in from Tara Kopp with McClatchy. SpaceX's Elon Musk has previously said he would recognize no government's law on Mars and will make his own. Well, this remains to be seen. It suggests that there will be actors who do not recognize international norms in space. How will Space Force deal with actors who may not recognize U.S. power influence in space in the future?
I think today there are really no norms of behavior in space. It's the wild, wild west. There's an outer space treaty from the 60s that talks about you can't put a weapons of mass destruction in orbit, and you can't militarize a planet, a celestial body. Other than that, there's no rules. I really believe there needs to be some rules, safe and professional conduct. I think our allies and partners that we operate with also think that, and we're working together. We exercise together again. We train together. One of the areas that we're focusing on is developing those norms of behavior of which we can operate collectively. We do that today. We operate in a very transparent manner. We operate in a way that demonstrates safe and professional behavior in the domain, and we hope others follow. Now, I'm not naive to think if there was a set of norms of behavior that everybody's going to follow. But I do think if you have those rules, it will help identify those that are running the red lights, if you will. And I think that would be important.
Okay, I'm going to jump over to some organizational questions. Last week, you said that you had developed a blueprint for Space Systems Command, and that'll be coming out soon, or in the next few weeks. Are you ready to lay that out now? And what sort of problems do you foresee this new organization tackling that existing organizations weren't set up to handle? And if you can't lay out the whole plan, could you preview what the new organization might look like?
Yeah, I'm not ready to go public with the whole plan. It's probably another week or so away from doing that. I will just tell you, our desire is to drive unity of effort across the government. And there's lots of different organizations that develop space capabilities. And now that we have a Space Force, my desire is to bring alignment to those organizations. So I think you'll see some of that. The other thing is we have to go fast. We have to go fast. People ask me what keeps me awake at night. That would be the one thing that I would say, if there was something that kept me awake at night, it would be our ability to go fast. And so you'll see an organization that's a very flatly designed organization. You'll see an organization that has authorities delegated down to the low level to allow the acquisition professionals to make the decisions rather than having to come all the way back up to the Pentagon to get those decisions. I think, and so flat organization, move at speed, delegating authorities, and unity of effort are all themes that I would say you'll see when we unveil what this new organization looks like.
Okay, I think you touched a little bit about moving rapidly. So that also includes an acquisition plan, and Congress is waiting for a new acquisition plan from the Space Force. Is Space Force close to submitting that, and can we expect that plan? What can we expect in that plan in terms of being able to move more rapidly and agilely?
I would
drilled into that.
We are continuing to work that. We're continuing to finalize the coordination of that through the government. My desire is to have that happen in the near term. What you'll see is very similar to the things that I talked about on the organization, as you would expect. You want to have flexibility. You want to have the ability to delegate authority down to lower levels. You want to have I think those are two big things: flexibility and the ability to delegate to move at speed. And I think because of the size of the Space Force, we're a relatively small force. Not relative, we're a small force, and we think there's a way to do this and still have the necessary congressional oversight, without reducing that oversight. That oversight's really, really important, and we're eager to get this to Congress and get some of these authorities that we think are going to be so important to us.
Okay. What's the timeline for incorporating Army and Navy units and space organizations into the Space Force? What can we expect in terms of numbers of troops transitioning or organizations transitioning, and what will not transition over?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And what you're going to see is that beginning this next year. The first year was all Air Force. We had to get up and running. We had to build the processes. I'm so proud of the team. When the Air Force was initially building a plan for how you're going to do a Space Force, this is before the National Defense Authorization Act was even signed. The initial plan said, when the law is signed, we're going to study this for about 18 months. And then at the 18-month point, we'll start operating. Well, when the law was signed, it said effective immediately or upon signature, Space Force is up and running. And so just think, if that 18-month plan would have stuck, I'd be sitting here today saying, in a couple months, we're going to be getting ready to stand something up. And look what we've done since then. And we built all the processes, all the personnel processes, brought, what started with one person on 20 December 2019, myself, is now over 4,100 folks. We've handpicked 6,700. This year, we're going to bring in roughly 30 or so from the other services. The year after that, there'll be more. We've also gone through and worked very closely with the other services to figure out what missions should come in and what missions should stay in those services. You can't, as we stand up the Space Force, when we stood up the Space Force, we had to do it in a way that didn't break the Air Force. Same thing with the Army and the Navy. And so we need to make sure that all those services are multi-domain services to have the ability to reap the benefits of space. But we think there's also some things that makes better sense to transfer over to the Space Force to bring synergy, enhance our readiness. And so we've done that work with the other services where I think we're at about the 98% agreement on those. We'll finalize that here in the next couple months as well. And then you'll begin to see those move over this next year.
Okay, great. What will the reported flat defense budget for 2022 do to the growth of the Space Force as you separate from the Air Force?
Yeah, so when we separated from the Air Force, we took the dollars that were associated with space that was in the Air Force and carved that out and made it an independent budget. So this first year, one of the things that we did was we submitted our first Space Force budget. We have to compete for dollars just like all other services. And so I would expect the competition for dollars it will be increased, and we're going to have to compete well. I will tell you, here over the last several years, it has become really clear and important that everybody understands the importance of space. So I think we'll compete well. But every taxpayer dollar is precious, and we have to make sure that we use every single dollar in the way that best gets after our national security. And we'll be part of that process, just like all the other independent services. That's why elevating space was so important as well, another factor, because now you have a seat at the table with an elevated voice for competing for precious dollars to be able to provide the capabilities that our nation needs.
Okay. The other services have highly developed research and development and acquisition structures, including government labs and program offices. When will the Space Force have similar structures, and how can technology developers establish both support and transition relationships with the Space Force to ensure we don't fall behind near peer competition?
Yeah, we have that today. We have that today, just like all the other services. What it used to be part of the Air Force. And so as we, back on 20 December, when the law was signed establishing the Space Force, it basically said everything that was in Air Force Space Command is now in the Space Force. And then in the months after that, we went through the rest of the Air Force and said, what other things does the Air Force do in space that should also come over to the Space Force? And so there was about 20 something different units that were being done. Let's say a training unit that was part of Air Education and Training Command, as an example. So we went through the rest of the Air Force and we did all the analysis to determine what should come over. One of the things that we determined needed to come over was the lab structure. And we have an Air Force research lab that had significant space capabilities in that. And so what we did was we built kind of a hybrid approach where we took those capabilities, brought them over to the Space Force, but we left them embedded at the lab to integrate with the Air Force lab because there's value in that integration. And so we've got separate parts of that lab that are now Space Force divisions in that, and they work very, very closely, seamlessly with the rest of the Air Force Research Lab.
Okay. One complaint from some Guardians is that Space Force is not well served by using Air Force Public Affairs, and there's concern it hurts the service's future. Are there plans to spin off a public affairs shop like the Marine Corps has helped to fix that problem?
No, there's no plans. We have a very professional, dedicated public affairs team, and I could not be more proud of them. What came into the Space Force were career fields that were purpose-built for space superiority, space operations, space engineering, space acquisition, cyber, as it relates to being able to defend our satellites from cyber attack. I mentioned space operations. So five different career fields, plus we're building an intelligence and the intelligence career fields. We're also building some software coders, a career field with software coders. And so there'll be 6 when we're all said and done career fields. All the rest of the folks that support the Space Force will remain in the Air Force. So logisticians, civil engineers, medical lawyers, all the support functions and public affairs in this example, all remain in the Air Force. Now, having said that, we have a dedicated team of Air Force public affairs folks that are dedicated to the space mission. And I'll tell you, it's the best team that I've ever been associated with as it relates to public affairs, and really, really proud of them.
Okay, great, thank you. This question comes from John Donnelly, Congressional Quarterly. Will there be a Space Force Academy comparable to the Air Force Academy?
There's no need to have a separate Space Force Academy. What we're doing is very similar to what the Marines do with the Naval Academy. And so we did a lot of research on that relationship, and the Marines basically have a detachment at the Naval Academy where they use to identify those cadets or those midshipmen that want to go into the Marine Corps. 2 years ago, there was 30 Air Force Academy cadets that came into the Space Force. Last year in April, when they graduated, the first year and these were the very first officers that directly commissioned into the Space Force. We commissioned 86 Air Force Academy cadets directly into the Space Force. This year, this coming May, when the Academy graduates, and in fact, I'm going there this evening to talk to these cadets. There's 116 cadets that are going to come into the Space Force. We built that detachment at the Air Force Academy. We are interviewing. The other opportunity that we have, we get the opportunity, because of our size, to interview everybody that comes into the Space Force and handpick. And so we've just completed the interview process for the juniors that will graduate in another year. And so we're very comfortable with that process. We're getting, again, significant numbers of cadets that are wanting to come in, and really top talent. We couldn't be happier. It's working out really well for us.
Okay. To ask another recruiting question, when you're looking at that, the Air Force is considered the hardest service to join, and Space Force is now considered even more selective. Do you think that's a fair categorization? And do you worry that the perception that you're the hardest service to join hurts future development for the Space Force?
I don't think so at all. I think we are very selective, and I think there's value in that. The numbers of folks that we take into that we recruit into the force every year are relatively small in numbers, and we're talking roughly 300 or 400 enlisted guardians and roughly 300 or so officer guardians. So it's relatively small. We don't have a recruiting problem. We have a lot more people wanting to come in. We can be very selective. We're also really focusing on making sure that we have a diverse and inclusive Space Force, and we're working that very hard as well. We think there's great opportunities, and I think, I mean, how many of you joined your organization to be part of a so-so or an average organization? You want to be part of the best, and so to have high standards, what I have found in my military service, when you have a unit that has really high standards, those are the most highest performing units that we have, and it's where morale and leadership flourishes.
Okay, thank you. The Space Force camouflage uniform looks a lot like the other services. When will we see the new Space Force dress uniforms?
Yeah, so we're getting really close. We've got a design that is being tailored right now, if you will. And I just had a phone call with my team on this yesterday. I would expect to see the next. I've seen one before. We went back to the drawing board, did a few more adjustments. I expect to see the next prototype here in about a month, and then we'll. It's important for all these things, like our names, our mottos. It's important, our ranks. It's important that the service has a say in this, and so. And all these things that we're doing on these cultural or identity issues, we want the Space Force's voice in this. And so, just as we've done on the other things, we will socialize this. We'll make sure that we get the inputs from the service, and we'll do the same thing on the uniforms. But I think we're getting really close to having a prototype that we'll model.
I think everyone's excited to see that. To get a little on the micro side here, what specific culture items are there that set the Space Force apart from the Air Force?
Well, one of the things that we've done is we've built the service, we've reorganized it to get after the biggest cultural piece, and that's to be bold, agile, and fast. If you listen to the way I described the domain of being very vast with things moving very, very quickly, you have to have people that are empowered to make decisions and that are trained to make those decisions. And so I think that's probably one of the cornerstones. We want to be a very innovative force. One of the things that we did for everybody that's coming in the Space Force, we've given them a license to go to what we call digital university, and we built courses so they can become more digitally fluent. I say that, everybody, everybody in the Space Force is going to speak two languages. One is their language, and the other is a computer language. And so I think one of the biggest cultural pieces that we're going to do instill is that innovative, bold, agile, flat structure that prioritizes guardians that can make a decision and move out.
Okay, and on a lighter note, putting excuse me, Netflix Space Force aside, what pop culture is out there that shows what Space Force does? Are there plans to engage with Hollywood to see how to get more out there?
Oh, it's interesting. I don't have any plans to engage with Hollywood. I'm lucky that I get to work with our movie stars each and every day, and those are the Guardians. I get to see them in real life. We will work to continue to put those folks out and tell their stories and be able to describe what they do. I think it's important for America to understand that they have a service there that provides them the capabilities that they rely on. But I'll tell you, I couldn't be prouder of the Guardians on this force. They're stellar, highly trained, highly motivated, and I would suggest to you, really, really excited about the future, about where we are and where we're headed. The excitement is palpable. We just a couple weeks ago, we did virtual swearing in ceremony across the globe, where we had, I think, 100 different locations from around the world. We have Guardians today in about 250 different locations across the globe. And so we did a virtual swearing in of about 100 Guardians. And then afterwards, it was all done virtually, and able to have conversations with these folks. And I'll tell you, just as when I was a young kid sitting in the living room of my house watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon for the first time, there's excitement across space. And it's not just in the national security space, it's in civil space with, going back to the moon and the Artemis program. It's with commercial space that we spent some time focusing on today, with all of the different innovative things that are happening in that space. And then it's in military space with the Space Force and Space Command. And I think that's going to resonate across the globe. And there's a lot of interest in space. In fact, I've gone to a few universities, and what I'm hearing is that they have more folks applying for STEM degrees and space STEM degrees specifically, just because of the inspiration that's happening across all sectors of space.
Okay, thank you. Before I ask the final question, let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event. Headliners co-team leaders Donna Leinwand and Lori Russo, today's headliner event coordinator and member of the Board of Governors Danny Selnick, Club Communications Director Lindsay Underwood, and Club Executive Director Bill McCarran. And to tell you about some upcoming headliners, on Monday, March 8th at 2 p.m., we'll host Rep. Jamie Raskin of Maryland, the lead House manager of the second Senate impeachment trial of former President Trump. On Wednesday, March 10th at 2 p.m., we'll chat with Amy Parn, senior correspondent for The Hill, and Jonathan Allen, a senior political analyst for NBC News, about their new book, Lucky: How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. We hope you'll join us. And now for our final question. I wanted to ask something a little bit fun. What is a crazy thing you've experienced in real life that would make for a great episode of the Netflix show Space Force? And one thing kind of comes to mind is it came as a surprise to everyone that, for instance, you have a horse in the 30th Space Wing at Vandenberg. So
we do have a horse. It's amazing. If you look at the global nature of the force, we have a horse at Vandenberg. We have a tugboat up at Thule, Greenland. It's a pretty incredible force. It's not large in numbers, but it's large in capabilities. I've thought a lot about that over the course of the year, and I've watched the Netflix show. It just shows the excitement, in my opinion, about space. And there are funny things that happen, but yeah, you would never know that we own more than one horse. We own a few horses out at Vandenberg, and we own a tugboat at Thule, Greenland, north of the Arctic Circle, where it's dark half of the year and then all light for half of a year. But I just did a segment for AFA with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and we were talking about this, and he said, you really should go on Saturday Night Live. And I told him, hey, if you get the ticket, I'll join you there. So it's an exciting time to be in our business. As I mentioned throughout, I couldn't be more proud of the folks that I'm privileged to lead. I clearly understand the criticality of this for our nation. Every person that comes to work with the Space Force comes to work with a heavy responsibility on their shoulders to get this right. And we are committed to doing so, and committed to doing so at speed. I can't thank you enough for hosting me today and for being the moderator. I also want to thank the team that you just thanked for making this happen. As I said, a year ago, who knew? I never knew what Teams was or whatever, or Zoom was. Now we're getting pretty fluent at doing these, and although I'd much prefer to be there in person with you, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to spend some time and at least be able to answer your questions.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I know that we all really look forward to watching the Space Force grow under your leadership.
Thank you very much, ma'am.